So let's speak now to Baroness Patience Wheatcroft, a crossbench peer, former editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal Europe and also the Sunday Telegraph. Baroness Wheatcroft, good morning.
Good morning, Amol.
Can I ask you the same question I asked Greg Dyke about your view of the original action? And I'm going to use the same word. Was Gary Lineker's tweet in which he referred to 1930s Germany acceptable?
It depends on the circumstances. I actually agree with everything Gary Lineker said. I find the rhetoric coming out of government about asylum seekers deeply, deeply depressing and unappealing. And I can completely understand why Gary Lineker said what he did.
But was it acceptable given his pay from the BBC, his prominence, and the importance that the BBC attaches to impartiality?
Well, it would be acceptable if it applied to BBC guidelines. The problem is that the BBC has guidelines, but it doesn't apply them fairly. In your previous interview, you just talked about Alan Sugar's position. I mean, guidelines only work if they are applied right across the board within the scope of the guidelines. And clearly, the BBC has failed on that. And I rather thought the game was given away yesterday on the PM programme, where John Whittingdale, the former Culture Secretary, was interviewed. And he absolutely thought that the BBC was right to suspend Gary Lineker in this situation. But he was asked, what if Gary Lineker had tweeted in favour of the new policy on asylum seekers? And his first reaction was, that would be a matter for Labour. So it's not a matter of principle. It's a matter of party politics. He then came back and said, of course, he hoped he would object to that too. But his first reaction was entirely party political.
That's why I said in my introduction to this item, this is about where power lies in modern Britain. And you had a very distinguished career in British newspapers. What do you think we have learnt this week about their enduring power?
I think they'd undoubtedly have influence. And I think that it's unfortunate how some parts of the British media have become so rabidly right-wing and party political. Given where they stand on Gary Lineker, I find it impossible to understand why they're not shouting from the rooftops for Richard Sharp to be suspended. After all, you have a chairman of the BBC who a cross-party Commons committee said his failure to own up to his role in facilitating an £800,000 loan for the then Prime Minister seriously undermined the BBC's impartiality. Richard Sharp is now undergoing 2 investigations, but he's not suspended. He's still in office. What does that do for morale in the BBC?
What do you think? It's the same difficult question I asked Greg Dyke, and sorry, but it is difficult. What do you think the BBC should do now?
I think it should work very closely with both sides as far as politics go to come up with a policy that it will then apply across the board. And in the meantime, I think it should certainly call for the suspension of a chairman who is clearly party political.
Well, there are ongoing investigations into Richard Sharp, aren't there?
And he's not suspended while they go on, whereas Gary Lineker is being suspended effectively while work goes on to decide quite what guidelines should cover his tweets. That doesn't seem fair, does it?
Baroness Patience Wheatcroft, crossbench peer, thank you very much indeed for joining us.